Well, good evening, all of you, and welcome to the Royal Society. For tonight's very special event, I should introduce myself. My name's Helen Arney. I'm a science presenter. I'm a geek songstress. I'm 1/3 of Full Frontal Nerdity, Festival of the Spoken Nerd. But if you count up all three of us, I am half of the X chromosomes. I'll leave you to work that out as a little puzzle as to how many women there are in our group. So what I need to do today is introduce tonight's event, which is about women writing science. I have a few housekeeping rules at the beginning. How ironic that I have housekeeping rules at an event about women writing science. My housekeeping rules, however, are mostly technological. If you could please switch off your mobile phones or turn them into airplane or silent mode, that would be fantastic. I've also been asked to tell you that there are no planned fire evacuations here tonight. Despite the Royal Society being the centre of experimental research, we are not going to research what happens in a fire tonight. If there is a fire alarm, it is real, and I need to point out the exits to you, which are at the front on the left, they're in the middle on the right, and they are at the rear on the left, by your perspective. You're pointing them out to me, that's even better. You, full marks. All right, so tonight's event as well is being webcast live and is also being recorded for the archives of the Royal Society. And this is actually the first in an event in a whole series about the history of science, and you can find out a lot more details about that on the website or in the programmes that I know you have on your seats as well. Something else you have on your seats is the feedback forms. I will remind you about them again at the end of the night, but do hang on to those because we would like those back. It's my pleasure, my absolute pleasure tonight to introduce and to host this event about women writing science, because it was 1945 that the first women were elected to the Royal Society: Kathleen Lonsdale, Marjorie Stevenson. But long before that, of course, women have been involved in conducting and also communicating science. And this Sunday just gone was International Women's Day, which I know many of you celebrated, as I did myself. So we are marking that occasion tonight by exploring the history of women publishing in journals, writing in popular science, and corresponding here with the Royal Society. And there's a few questions that we want to discover about this evening. So we want to know how it was that early women scientists used writing to further their careers, and what were the ways that women were limited by their gender, and what did the influence of different subject specializations have on those women, and what did their limited access to education mean for their careers. And we have three fantastic speakers tonight who are going to bring some ideas on those different questions. And those speakers are here with me on my right. So firstly, we have Patricia Fara. She is a senior tutor in philosophy of science at Clare College, Cambridge. She specialises in the history of science of the 18th century, and particularly the role of women and in the Enlightenment. So she's authored, she tells me many books. I've got the number at least 10, one of which is 4,000 years of science in a single book, which in covering only 400 pages, I can only imagine is a whirlwind tour of science. And she herself read physics as an undergraduate, as I did, and left science as I did, and yet has come back to study history and philosophy of science. And so she will be our first speaker. Our second speaker is Dr. Claire Jones. She's come to us from the University of Liverpool, where she's a teacher and an honorary fellow. And her research interests are around where society and science meet in the 18th and 19th century, especially the history of women from the 19th century to World War I. And there's particularly some ideas that I'm really interested in about femininity and masculinity, and whether intellect itself has a gender. And that's a question that I would like to answer. And we also have Emily Winterburn, who's our third speaker. She's a visiting research fellow in science and religion at the University of Leeds. And she has a particular interest in scientific families, and particularly the Herschels. And she tells me her PhD on such a thing is at some point to be published. I shall look forward to that. And she particularly studies women in science and science education in the 18th and 19th century, and also works as a curator. So those are our three speakers for tonight. Let me explain the format as well. Each of our speakers will talk for about 10 minutes on their particular subject that they're bringing here now. Then we will have a short discussion and open up the panel to questions. And at the end of the night, we are very proud to be able to unveil can you only guess what's underneath? Underneath is the completed bust of Dr. Lucy Green. And we will explain more about that later. But if you are wondering why there is an apparition on stage, we are not being haunted by a ghost, ladies and gentlemen. That is the bust of Lucy Green that we very much look forward to unveiling at the end of the night. So before we start off with our first speaker, we have something very special to show you, which is a video that's been made as part of the 350th 350th anniversary of the Philosophical Transactions, which is the world's largest and longest running scientific journal. This particular edition is Science Stories Equilibrium. It's called Where Are the Women? I don't think we need to answer that one right now. And what it does is this particular edition, it focuses on the rise of women writing papers and being published in scientific journals. And we have a video to show you, which is about that journey through the 18th and 19th century and the stepping stones towards women becoming fellows at the Royal Society in 1945. So this is a short video presented by Dame Athena Donald, Professor Sarah Jane Blakemore, and it focuses mostly on Hertha Ayrton and Alice Lee, who were two pioneering women scientists who challenged the status quo by publishing their bold new ideas. If we can play the video.
I got into science by first of all doing a degree in psychology, and that degree is quite biologically oriented, so I became more and more interested in the brain and decided to do a PhD in neuroscience.
I'm a professor of physics. I research and lecture in physics in Cambridge. My actual area of research is what's known as soft matter physics, which is pretty much physics of everyday stuff like food and animals, plants and plastics.
It was only when I left school at the age of 18 and started to work in labs and then do my degree, that's when I started to realise that there was this stereotype, there was this attitude that it was unusual for a woman to be doing science.
Having a female physics teacher at my school was really important because it enabled me to imagine going on with physics and having high quality physics teaching. I think it was rather a surprise to my family that this was what I wanted to do. The idea that a girl could want to do physics, it's just not talked about enough.
The Royal Society was founded over 350 years ago, and of course there was only men doing science and philosophy around then.
I don't think it's necessarily the case that anyone wrote down that women could not become fellows. It was simply that they didn't get that opportunity. Society was organised in ways that implicitly were sexist. Women would not have been expected to be engaged in discussion in public places. I think that just would have been seen as rather odd. This is an early paper by Hertha Ayrton on the electric arc, which she wasn't allowed to read. It had to be read by a sort of sponsor for her.
She was nominated to become an FRS, and there were many people who signed the nomination form.
She was nominated and was declined on the grounds that she was married. And yet they awarded her a prize. They gave her the Hughes Medal.
They did.
It's a horrible thing to happen, that because you are married, you are not eligible, despite the fact lots of men fully recognised her ability and the excellence of the science she was doing. We have moved on since then. Publishing is a huge part of the scientist's life, because until you publish, you can't claim to have discovered something, if you like. The trouble is, historically, to publish in the Royal Society journals, you had to have an FRS, a Fellow of the Royal Society, who would submit it. So if you were a woman and not moving in the sort of charm circles of other FRSs, that must have been much harder.
So this is Alice Lee's paper about brain size and intelligence.
Alice Lee was really interesting. She was working in the late 19th, early 20th century on the relationship between the size of the skull and intelligence. So she had all these sophisticated measures of how to measure the capacity of the skull. So interestingly, she didn't really have any very sophisticated measures of intelligence.
So she just assumed that if you were at UCL, you were intelligent?
Well, she did divide students up into high intelligent, average and dull.
Dull. That's
but just according to her subjective judgment.
Oh dear.
It was previously believed that intelligence was related to skull size and that men have bigger skulls than women on average, so men are more intelligent than women on average, and she disproved that in her paper.
She mentions names. That must have been quite an issue.
It would never happen now.
You would just be subject one or something.
Exactly.
Yeah. So she was able to say that even her supervisor Pearson's brain was not that big.
Not particularly big.
Despite his great brain.
Yeah.
The Sex Disqualification Act was introduced in 1919, which meant at that point that the Royal Society couldn't explicitly exclude women. But the first women weren't elected until 1945. And it meant it was possible other women could aspire to this, because up till that point, they must have wondered if ever the Society would let women in.
This is an early paper by Kathleen Lonsdale, quite a long time before she was elected.
Oh yes, 1929.
A paper on benzene. I think some derivative of benzene to crystallise so she could work out its structure. Her election was along with Marjorie Stevenson, so the pair of them got elected together. Amazing, but possibly also intimidating.
I expect she might have been used to that.
She probably was used to it. I expect she was always in a minority of but one. These are the certificates, so they've had to cross out his and write in her as deserving that honour. Lots of people signed up to recommend them. They only needed 6, I think. They were originally proposed in 1944. It took 2 years.
I've been on several different committees at the Royal Society and they've all had a really good proportion of women on them. So from what I see of the Royal Society, it's not this kind of bastion of male dominance at all.
I've always found the Royal Society incredibly welcoming. I was made a fellow in 1999, and that was the year 5 women were elected, and it was the largest number that there had been up till then. An awful lot of them are people you've never heard of. I think they were just wealthy people rather than good scientists.
Men in wigs.
Men in wigs, absolutely. The Royal Society is trying really hard to improve its image, to improve the message it gives. The rehanging of the portraits is part of that, to change the imagery in this building, because there is no doubt it has had a very old-fashioned, all-male look to it.
Of course, there are the new portraits which are going to be hung around the Royal Society, and we've got 3 of them here. And this is Sunetra Gupta, who's a mathematical epidemiologist from Oxford. Francesca Happe, who's a professor of psychology. She's an expert on autism. So this last one is the portrait of me.
Oh, fantastic. And this will be hung here too?
Yeah, so hopefully when they rehang these paintings, they'll also add more of other women.
So that when people come into the Society, they realise that women are welcome.
Women are scientists too, and it really does make a difference.
It makes a big difference, particularly for school children. And
exactly, where you can really have an impact. Nothing happens quickly, but the more women publishing in science and then becoming FRSs would have encouraged younger women to see women can take part in science too and reach the highest echelons of scientific society, becoming FRSs.
Fantastic. And I understand that, can I just double check, that is online somewhere as well, so it's, is that able for people to share? So if you enjoyed that video, please do share it and its content. I very much enjoyed that and I will be doing that this week. But it is now the turn of our speakers to take the floor. Ladies and gentlemen, please, if I can ask you to put your hands together for the first of our speakers, Dr Patricia Fara.
how do I get my PowerPoint?
Patricia's PowerPoint will magically appear. Will it?
Thank you. Well, thank you all very much for coming, and thank you very much also to the Royal Society for inviting me to speak at this very exciting event. I think when we think of the history of science, we predominantly think of great discoveries, great ideas, and great people. But if you ask yourself the question, how is it that over the last few hundred years, science has become so important and so powerful in our society, then it's very obvious that you have to communicate the ideas. And that's exactly the role that women were playing and were absolutely crucial in the transmission of science from one place to another. So this picture that I'm showing on the right is the frontispiece of a book by Margaret Bryan. She set up her own school for girls at the end of the 18th century, and she also wrote this textbook, A Compendious System of Astronomy. Now, these books were ostensibly written for girls. They were often written by women, but there were a lot of men who read them as well. The most famous example is this book, Conversations on Chemistry, which was written by Madame Marsay. It became quite a bestseller here and in America and was translated into other European languages. And Michael Faraday read this. It was the first science book that he ever read, and it was that book that prompted him to devote himself to a life in science. And to his credit, right until the end of his life, he always acknowledged Madame Marsay and thanked her for having given him such a good introduction to science. So that's one example of a very famous scientist who came into science because of the influence of women, but I'm going to talk mainly tonight about an even more famous example. I'm going to talk about this guy, Isaac Newton. And it's all very well sitting under your apple tree and having your great inspiration, but that is no use unless you tell anybody about it. And he deliberately wrote his great book on gravity in very complex mathematical ideas because he said he wasn't interested in being baited by little smatterers in mathematics. It was Isaac Newton's followers who communicated his ideas. He lectured at Cambridge University, but he was an absolutely lousy lecturer. This is a comment that two students were overheard to be saying to each other in the street. There walks the man, Isaac Newton, who lectures to the walls, by which they meant he was such a terrible lecturer that none of the students ever came. He only had the walls to lecture to. And the reason that his ideas became so important was because he had a whole host of followers who translated, who disseminated, who communicated his ideas and simplified them. It's very easy to think, looking back, that Isaac Newton, the apple fell on his head and instantly the whole of physics changed. It wasn't like that. It took many, many, many years for his ideas to become accepted and to become propagated. And I'm going to tell you a bit about my favourite heroine in the whole of the history of science. And this is this woman, Émilie du Châtelet. And you can see here she's very beautiful, she's beautifully dressed. She's holding a pair of dividers, which is the traditional symbol for a mathematician or a natural philosopher. And she's got all these heavy physics tomes in front of her. The reason I admire her so much is she completely contradicts an idea that was quite prevalent in the 20th century, that you can either be a normal woman or a good scientist, but you can't be both. And one of the things that she said was the important thing in life is to take pleasure, to enjoy life. And by that, she meant intellectual pleasure, and she also meant going to parties, dressing well. She loved dancing, and she was also enjoyed gambling, which if you're an expert mathematician is probably quite a good career to adopt. And of course, she couldn't go to university, but she was very sensible. She chose to be born into a very rich family with a very enlightened father, and she had a very good education when she was a girl, and then she hired tutors to teach her Newtonian mathematics. While she was being brought up, the prevailing scientific hero in France was that man, René Descartes, and his ideas still prevailed. And when the new ideas came from Isaac Newton, they were seen as being English and contrary to French ideas about how the universe is constructed. When the famous essayist and playwright Voltaire went to when he went to England in the 1720s, he said, "A Frenchman arriving in London finds things very different in natural sciences and everything else. He has left the world full, he finds it empty." And what he meant was that in England, with Isaac Newton's gravitation, you have a universe which is basically empty space, and you have the force of gravity extending across it. On the contrary, in France, Descartes imagined a universe that was absolutely, absolutely packed with tiny, tiny particles whirring around, because according to him, the only way something could move was if it was directly hit. So Émilie du Châtelet and Voltaire lived together for about 20 or 30 years. Her husband was extremely accommodating and gave them a chateau and knew all about it. That was all fine. And then in 1738, this book came out, and this is the book that is said single-handedly to have had the most effect on converting the French people to Newtonianism. Elements of Newton's philosophy, and you see it's got Voltaire's name on the title page. If you look at the frontispiece, you can see rather a different story. There's Voltaire at the bottom, dressed up like a Roman scribe with a laurel wreath on his head. And there's Newton sort of up in the clouds. It's sort of pretty unclear by this stage whether he is God or just jolly near God. And there's the light coming through his head. So all this Newtonian information is being reflected onto the mirror of the goddess of truth. The goddess of truth is Émilie du Châtelet. And she is reflecting the light down onto Voltaire's head. And Voltaire himself acknowledged how much she had contributed. She was the mathematician, she was the person who did the science. And as soon as this book came out, he raced off with relief away from all that mathematics and went back to writing plays and poetries. She, on the other hand, went on with a scientific career. And one of the biggest books that she produced was the Isaac Newton's Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy in French. It's still the only complete version in French. She went back to the original Latin to translate it, and she didn't just translate the Latin into French. She provided a very, very long commentary which explained and also criticised Newton's ideas and tried to reconcile them with those of Leibniz and Descartes. And she also provided long footnotes summarising the research that had been done since then. And you can see it came out in 1759 after she died. And that was the year that Halley's Comet came back absolutely, absolutely on cue. So this book had an enormous influence in France in confirming that Newton's ideas were right. So France became Newtonian, and Newton, the English Newton, had a French successor, the French Newton, called Pierre-Simon Laplace. And he wrote a very complicated book called La Mécanique Céleste, Celestial Mechanics, that was enormously influential and introduced the type of deterministic Newtonianism that we have today. And du Châtelet had her English equivalent. Just as she translated Newton's Principia into English, Mary Somerville, 19th century scientist, translated Laplace into English. And again, she didn't just translate the words, she also explained the mathematics, which relied heavily on calculus, which English people were not nearly so good as the French. So this was a very important book that was used by scientists and used by students. Mary Somerville did have a paper in the Philosophical Transactions on the magnetism of the sun, but she wasn't allowed to enter the Royal Society, let alone read her paper for herself. So her husband, who was a doctor, read it for her, and the best, I'm sorry to be critical of the Royal Society, but the best the Royal Society could do at the time was put her marble bust in the hallway. She became known as the Queen of the Sciences. And that's because she not only translated Laplace's book, she wrote very, very many books of her own which explained the latest scientific ideas, which synthesized them and brought them together. And she had a huge audience, and she was a very, very prolific writer. Despite being so eminent, despite being so skilled at maths, she wrote in her autobiography, "I hid my papers as soon as the bell announced a visitor, lest anyone discover my secret." And I think that remark in itself indicates the amount of prejudice that she was working against, that she had to conceal what she was doing from the outside world. She also enormously lacked confidence, which I think is a problem that affects a lot of women in science. They're hugely proficient, but don't really believe in their own abilities. She hid her papers. She did become very well known. She became the queen of the sciences. But there must be thousands and thousands of other women who remain anonymous, whose lives are very, very difficult to find out about, but who played enormously important roles in communicating science and enabling the latest ideas to be spread across the world so that they could be developed further and science could progress. So I think we owe a great debt to these unknown, forgotten women. Thank you.
Thank you. Please don't put your hands down. Continue that applause for our next speaker, of course, Dr. Claire Jones.
Thank you, and I'm very happy to be here on this occasion. My contribution takes us up to the final decade of the 19th century and into the 20th century, in the years before World War I. I mean, we know that the first women elected as fellows to the Royal Society didn't happen until 1945. But the story before that wasn't one of exclusive masculinity. My interest, certainly in the later part of the 19th century, is why the Royal Society connected with women to a large extent, and women worked on the periphery, but to actually let them into the fellowship was a line in the sand that the Royal Society really didn't want to cross. So I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute, but suffice to say that when we're writing history of science, to concentrate solely on the all-male fellowship list hides the participation of women operating at the margins of the Royal Society, women publishing their science, but also participating in other ways as well. Between 1880 and 1914, some 60 women published more than 170 papers in the Philosophical Transactions and the Proceedings, including 50 papers before 1900. And now these numbers are very small compared to men, so it's important not to get carried away. But I think women were making their presence increasingly felt. And this was no surprise, really, because the universities had begun opening their doors to women. So more women were being able to access a formal scientific education, nearly equivalent to that available to their brothers, albeit often they weren't awarded the degrees. But at Cambridge Girton College for women had been established in 1869, Newnham a little while later. At the University of London, which opened most of its degree programmes to women in 1878, various colleges were training women in the biological, chemical and physical sciences. Many of the papers published in the Royal Society journals were co-authored with men, often these women's tutors and often fellows of the Royal Society. So they had kind of an informal link with the Society through them. For example, in the years around 1900, a flurry of papers were co-authored by various female researchers, and Carl Pearson, who was featured in the video we saw when they were talking about Alice Lee. Not only Alice, but a whole handful, about half a dozen women researched with Carl Pearson, who was a statistician and eugenicist at University College London. Although the growth of higher education was a turning point for scientific women, again, we mustn't get carried away. In particular, there was some resistance to women entering the laboratory. It wasn't so bad if women students entered the laboratory for just study, but if they went into the laboratory for research purposes, that seemed to pose a little bit of a threat. For example, as late as 1911, William Ramsay, a chemist at UCL, a Royal Society Fellow and Nobel Prize winner, was reported to rather discourage women in his laboratory for research purposes. It's interesting, the laboratory at this time was kind of configured as a really masculine space. And a letter, a reminiscence from a student at UCL, said that women were discouraged from seeking admission to chemistry classes as they may, quote, be scarred for life and have their clothes burnt off them as men threw the chemicals around. And that would be awful, because a woman, if she was scarred, might not be marriageable material, which was thought of really problems. Women's connections to the Royal Society was not restricted to publishing. A handful of women received Royal Society research grants, and we've already heard in the video that the Royal Society awarded the Hughes Medal for Original Research to Hertha Ayrton in 1906. And of course, Marie Curie had been awarded a medal jointly with her husband Pierre a few years earlier. Women scientists were also present at the Royal Society Conversationes. The Society held two of these. There were sort of society events each year. The first in May was named the Black One. As explained the Times in 1900, it was exclusively confined to the sombre sex, which means men. The second, held in June, was generally known as Ladies' Night and reported as less severely scientific. And women exhibited at both of these. Hertha Ayrton demonstrated her experiments into the electric arc in 1899, and you can see that the Daily News was really surprised that, you know, this petite black-haired woman was in charge of a really dangerous-looking exhibit, a fierce art light enclosed in glass, and apparently she was not a bit afraid of it, which was good news. Hertha exhibited again in 1904, and other women exhibitors included astronomer Annie Maunder, Edith Saunders, a biologist, paleontologist Dorothea Bate, and a couple more. One woman that I want to talk about just a little, because her case sort of illustrates how women have got forgotten by the history of science. A woman in 1904 who demonstrated at the Conversazioni was Rena Scott, and she demonstrated her slow motion films, which made use of an early chromatograph, which was kind of a filmless camera. It had only just been invented in the 1890s. She used this to make what she called animated photographs of the growth and movement of plants. So Rena demonstrated in slow motion time-lapse photography the opening of buds, the pollination by a bee, the unravelling of a shoot, and other manifestations of plant activity. Now, Rena's film was really, really early, and today we're all familiar with these slow-motion time-lapse images on our TV screens. But research the history of them, and you won't find the name of Rena Scott. But how could Rena do this? Well, she was part of the London scientific elite on the periphery of the Royal Society through her husband, who was a fellow and one-time president, I think. And this is typical of the way that women access science, through an informal relation and through networks. Rena carried out her scientific work at home, away from any institutional setting. And this, again, is a typical pattern for women around this time, especially married women who didn't have access to the institutions of professional science, for the most part. Because of this, women such as Rena have not had the recognition they deserve, because if we look at only institutional records of science, we don't find women, and we need to look elsewhere to find them. Also, it's the case that because of the kind of understanding of women's role at the time, they seem automatically to be assigned the role of assistants, which often wasn't the case, especially if they were in a scientific marriage. Turning to Hertha Ayrton just quickly. She was another exhibitor at the Royal Society Conversazioni. I mean, Hertha is best known, as mentioned in the video we've just seen, for being nominated for a fellowship in 1902. She failed to get elected, but there was a big fight on the council, and the modernisers backing her fought their case hard. And my view is that if the people had been different, she might have got in. To put this all into context, the issue of women was exercising many a learned scientific body at this time. With the increasing specialisation and professionalisation of science, new scientific associations were being established at a phenomenal rate, and many of these considered the question of whether they should or should not admit women as fundamentally a question of status. And this status was almost quite literally embodied in the people admitted as fellows. For the Royal Society, the worry about admitting women was that it may threaten the Society's elite status and taint it with amateurism. This was especially important around 1900, as members of the Council were expressing concern as to whether the Society would be able to hold its place as the mother of all scientific societies, with so many new societies actually coming into existence. These new societies were often expressly catering for amateurs, women and others, refused membership elsewhere. So, I mean, it was a real fear. If the Royal Society let women in, would they be tainted with amateurism? A lot of societies were arguing this, and you can see from my slide there was a lot of fudges. Often women's money was accepted, however they weren't allowed to attend meetings, and there was other fudges done as well. The sensitivity of the Royal Society to the question of women fellows is kind of shown by a letter that was sent to every single fellow explaining their decision over Hertha's nomination. Here they argued that legal opinion had advised that the Society's charter forbade the consideration of a married woman because a married woman's person was covered in that of her husband. And they argued their hands were tied, and in this way they kind of ducked making a decision and therefore relieved themselves of any blame. I think my research looks at women scientists, a modest number perhaps, but are active in science research and publishing in the decades around 1900. And given the difficulties they worked under, I sometimes think the better question is not why so few women in science, but sometimes why so many, especially around this time. Being denied a fellowship and professional position, except perhaps for teaching in a women's school or college. Considerably limited opportunity for scientific women. For example, in 1910, Hertha was moved to write to the then Royal Society President Archibald Geikie to be asked to allow to have the privileges of a fellow in one respect, to be allowed to read unpublished papers, because she said not having that ability was really harming her work and putting her at great disadvantage. I've not found a reply, but I don't think that she was allowed that. So just to finish, despite the barriers in front of them, these women researched, published, and were part of scientific networks like their male counterparts. They evidence that science does not have the exclusive masculine colouring that our mainstream history of science sometimes suggest. And just to finish, I've got a kind of Where Wally picture for you to find. I mean, this is the Mathematical Congress in Paris in 1900, and Hertha is there, and I'm just wondering if you can spot her. Yeah, to the far left. Thank you.
Fantastic. And our final speaker, please, Dr. Emily Winterburn.
Hello. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the period between the two last speakers, I guess. Specifically, I'm going to talk about kind of women broadly in the 19th century, but about what they were able to do. So not so much women who were involved with the Royal Society, but other women who were just involved in science in some way, and how it is that they did that, but also what it is that restricted or shaped the kind of involvement that they could have in science. And specifically, I'm going to look at how specialisation kind of shapes how women got involved in science. So by specialisation, so what I mean here is the sort of broad trend of the 19th century. So it's not a kind of one replaces the other. It's more that one style becomes more common and one style becomes less common. So broadly speaking, over the 19th century, work of all kinds, but including scientific work, moves outside of the home. So it moves sort of away from family life. And that means that family collaborations, although they still happen, they're less common. So family collaborations like William and Caroline Herschel working together on a scientific project, that becomes less common as doing science within the home becomes less common. Also, qualifications and training become more important in terms of your access to science and in terms of how how you're received in science. And again, that's a sort of a barrier for women because women's education is different. I know that there's starting to become opportunities for some women to go to university, but it's quite small. And it's also a lot of the education before university isn't really structured, isn't really designed with that aim. So there's a very limited number of women who are able to do that. And also publishing expands. So there just are more books being published, but because of that, they then become subdivided. More sort of becomes more, the divide becomes more obvious, and so the divide between sort of academic writing for a particular audience and writing for the popular audience becomes sort of more exaggerated. So in all these cases, so some of these cases there are actual tangible barriers. I mean, there are restrictions on, certainly, like Cambridge doesn't let women receive degrees and doesn't let women don't go to Cambridge until towards the end of the century. But some of them are actual tangible, you cannot do this. But quite a lot of them are really more to do with sort of what's considered appropriate and therefore what shapes the kind of education that you get given with all the best intentions. Girls and boys' education is different. The way that women and men are expected to behave is different. And so that, even though that's not an actual rule, it does kind of shape the way that men and women can interact with science. So by what I mean about these kind of different attributes is there are some sort of fairly strict rules about appropriate behaviour and desirable characteristics, sometimes kind of dressed up as though these are biological differences, but whatever the explanation, they still shape the kind of education that you get given. So it's sort of reinforced, because if you're saying that this is what men and women are like, and then your education shapes how that's developed, and then that determines sort of the sort of role that you play in the world. So for men, this meant that education and their expected role in the world was all bound up with ideas of sort of discipline and sort of being analytical, robust, clear thinking, and it's also to do with kind of preparing for the corrupting world of commerce and of the sort of the public sphere. Women, on the other hand, their education and their futures are all tied up in this. Their education is far more to do, or how they're seen is far more to do with having social roles. Having that you should be sort of cultured, broad, social skills, a broad knowledge in lots of different areas. So it's not to do. It's sort of a very different approach to how you're educated. So in terms of education, that means that boys' education tended to be about rigorous study and about sort of training a boy's mind to think critically and thoroughly. And originally this was thought to be done by very careful study of Latin grammar, and then gradually sort of science becomes part of the same sort of idea, that can teach the same kind of rigorous thinking. Girls, on the other hand, are taught a little bit of everything, and so sort of a bit of languages, a bit of history, so, broadly, lots and lots of things, so that you're sort of considered cultured, and you can converse in lots of different subjects, but nothing to the extent where you'd be considered an expert. So the historian Michelle Cohen has got a really lovely term for this. When she talks about an idealised Victorian education, she talks about boys' education as being, the ideal was that boys' education was deep and narrow, and girls was wide and shallow. So it's this idea that you should have a little bit of knowledge of lots of things. And so this idea of kind of appropriateness means that women's participation in science in this period tends to be characterised by roles that incorporate a lot of these female attributes. So the way that either the way that women participate or the way that participation is presented is shaped by kind of this ideal of what a woman should be all about. And so often you get female roles being presented as being sort of assistant organisers, so the wife or sister who can use their kind of broad, non-specialist understanding of a project to bring organisation to a family scientific project. Another one is social facilitator, so the role of kind of building networks building sort of informal networks among scientists or among scientific organisations, that kind of organising social role. And another one is populariser, so bringing together these qualities of sort of versatility, sociability and culture, and drawing them together and using communication, so the idea of sort of being able to draw lots of ideas together and then communicate them, sort of effortlessly using those social skills. So that's where the idea of women being particularly good at sort of popular publishing comes in. So if we just kind of look at a very small number of examples, so they're all in astronomy, because that's what I know about. Elizabeth Brown, there are kind of similarities between all these women. So Elizabeth Brown's a solar astronomer in the 19th century, so she doesn't have a formal education. She's taught at home, like most girls, and her entry to science, like most women's entry to science in this period, was she had a father who was interested in astronomy. So for most of her adult life, she had a caring role looking after her parents or looking after her father. And it's only after he dies that she begins to kind of develop a sort of separate sort of role in science. And there she writes for a popular audience. She writes about her travels to view eclipses. And she also has a kind of organising role. She's one of the founder members of the British Astronomical Association, so kind of bringing together astronomers and astronomical societies and bringing them together. So that's kind of organising role, but still important in terms of how science actually happens. Another example I've got is Agnes Mary Clark. So she's possibly the certainly one of the most famous popularisers of astronomy in the 19th century. So she writes numerous books, both on historical and on contemporary astronomy. She introduces a lot of people to astronomy. Their first introduction to astronomy is reading her books. And she relays really quite complex ideas, but kind of brings it down. She takes complex ideas, but kind of explains them in a way that is understandable, even if you haven't had that kind of university education. And like Brown, she's homeschooled. She has a father who's interested in astronomy. She also has a brother, and her brother, as he's at university, he teaches her the maths and physics that he learns at university. So she effectively has a university education, though it's kind of once removed. But again, she uses this kind of education to find herself a popularising role, and that's how she uses her kind of writing in science. And the last example that I've got is, just because the thing I do is on Herschel's, is on, this is the only picture that I could find, but the youngest child is Constance Herschel. So she's kind of got even better education than the last two. So she's brought up surrounded by science. Her father teaches her maths. She goes off, she's one of the first women to go to Cambridge. She studies at Girton College, where her letters home are full of kind of complaints about how she sees the other women being treated by the university, that they're allowed to do this, but then they're not allowed to get this kind of, they're not allowed to get degrees, but they're allowed to do these exams. And it's just full of, she's just very cross about it, and she's kind of relating all the irritation that her fellow students feel as well. But she stays on at Girton, and she finished her degree, and she stays on and works in the lab. So she sort of has the beginnings of what we think of as being a scientific career, except that then in 1881 she gets married and she just stops, and she follows her husband's career and she brings up her children. But then when they're older, she then kind of returns to science, but in this popularising role. So she writes several books for a non-academic audience. The best known is that she writes a kind of family history about her grandfather, William Herschel, and his sister, Caroline Herschel, where she gives equal billing to both scientists, with both astronomers. So there's sort of certain patterns that each woman has a slightly better access to education than the one before, but they all kind of end up doing similar things, because it's not just a question of their access to education. It's in terms of what they can do, not easily, but it's sort of almost it's a kind of more acceptable thing for them to do. So in a sense, they're all exceptional cases. They all get published, which is not always the case for for all the women that are working in science. But it's through their example we can kind of see we get a sense of some of the constraints that might have affected lots of women, so not just the kind of the women that we get to hear about, but a lot of women that are working in science. So you can see the constraints in terms of their education, not just their access to education, but the way that their education is shaped to be kind of a certain type. You can see in terms of they're restrained by their access, their time is constrained in terms of their caring roles. And also they're kind of constrained in terms of what sort of roles they can then take that seem perfectly acceptable to take in the public. So they don't try and really publish academic papers. They can see a kind of better path for themselves in publishing popular astronomy in each case. So I think that's where the project of kind of bringing women into the history of science in meaningful ways gets quite messy, because I think it's that the roles historically women have had tend to have been quite different. Sorry. That the way they've presented them have been quite different to their male contemporaries. So they often even end up with popularising and organisational roles, but this is because this is what suits their education best, and it's also because that's what's kind of considered most appropriate. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Actually, I should be sitting down again because I think there's a couple of things that I'd like to pick up on that all three of you have mentioned, but also some of you individually have mentioned. I wanted to find out a little bit more about some of these things. So we're going to have a quick discussion now, and then we'll open the floor to questions as well. Because one thing that occurred to me while you were talking was that it seems there are some subjects that are more accessible to women, or throughout history different subjects have been more accessible to women at different times. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about how that's changed, because it seems that subjects like astronomy and mathematics were very popular at one time, and then more recently it's been things like crystallography and the more multidisciplinary subjects. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about whether that's changed.
Well, certainly, obviously Emily's the expert on astronomy, but astronomy did stay in the home a bit longer, so there were more women doing that really. Mathematics as well was thought of in the early part of the 20th century as fairly safe for women to do. It wasn't like classics that, oh my goodness, women would know about all these awful things. Mathematics was safe like that. Nothing scurrilous would come. It was
That's
also
extraordinary.
quite... Yeah,
so mathematics was sort of safe because it didn't involve any sort of biology.
All these terrible things you'd read in the classics, I mean, it's just not for women's ears, so...
Like what? Let us hear. We're allowed.
But I mean, mathematics was safe, it was quiet, it was sedate, you could do it with a pencil. It was... yeah, it was safe. And in fact, women did really well in the mathematics tripos at Cambridge in the first decades of the 20th century.
Because there was an awful time when a woman
Philippa.
A woman came top of the whole exams, and in Cambridge that's traditionally called being the first wrangler. But of course it was absolutely unthinkable that a woman could possibly do that, so she was just sort of pushed on one side. And in any case, women couldn't graduate from Cambridge University until 1948. They could only get a certificate. But going back to astronomy, I think going back to the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries, a lot of women were doing astronomy because, exactly as Claire said, it was something that happened in the home, and also it was a craft. It wasn't something that even as a man you had to go to university with. And there were a lot of practitioners making the lenses, and if you were working at home in a small family business, the daughters as well as the sons got recruited into the family trade. And so there's a lot of records of women carrying out astronomical observations when you go further back in time. It's one of the fields they could specialise in.
Yeah. And earlier on it would be botany as well, which was thought of a wonderful pastime, genteel pastime for a lady to find out, and a girl to find out about God's book, nature.
Yeah, but not about how they reproduce.
Well, no, when sort of the Linnaean system came in, then it was rather... got a bit racy, and it was
absolutely right. Botany, after the Linnaean system came in, Erasmus Darwin, who was Charles Darwin's grandfather, wrote rather a sort of racy poem called "The Loves of the Plants," and it was and absolutely, botany was seen as a totally unsuitable subject for women because it had all this allusions to the male and female stamens and pistils of plants, and they sort of invented new words so that it could be sort of softened for women, so they wouldn't have to know about that nasty sex. And going out in the gardens was seen as totally unsuitable.
That is astonishing, because that's what interests me is that obviously astronomy and mathematics have been quite influenced by women early on, but they seem to be somewhat more male-dominated in the 20th century. But other subjects like crystallography and more interdisciplinary subjects like biophysics, now today, they seem to be more women in areas of brain science, and I wonder if there's a historic precedent for that, because that seems extraordinary.
Well, you do find that as new subjects emerge, that you get a lot of women in them, and then they become more established and they become more male. I mean, computer science is the classic example.
I think another thing is a lot of women say that discuss the importance of a role model in their early life, and at Cambridge the Braggs were in charge of crystallography, and they very much favoured or approved the idea of women working in their laboratories, which was extremely sensible, because to be a woman and to get that far, you were far cleverer than most of the men. So someone like Rosalind Franklin, for example, came to Cambridge because Cambridge supported crystallography, whereas in her own university, Oxford, where she was an undergraduate, it was more difficult. So I think you get the sort of local effects of particular people who are recruiting women or tolerating women or supporting women is very important.
Because I think that's very interesting that it hasn't just been women supporting women. Clearly there is a huge history of men supporting women, and it's just so interesting with Hertha Ehrson not being elected a fellow, that you mentioned that it was a very close call, that if the people had been slightly different who voted, it was 1 or 2 votes out.
I think it could have gone in the other direction.
And I think that says so much about how almost half of them were in support of it.
Yes.
And just over half were against it. And I think it's very easy to think of the half that are against it as being the majority, whereas in fact it's a lot less clear cut than that.
Yes.
So I find that very interesting. Are there any other figures, whether they're male or female, who have been these huge supporters of female scientists? You've mentioned the Braggs.
Maybe Lord Rayleigh could be somebody. I mean, at the Cavendish Laboratory at Cambridge, which Patricia might know more than me, but the whole history of that laboratory has been written like some heroic masculine kind of story of these sort of great men. But there was certainly around the 1890s, early 1900s, a whole series of female researchers, and I know that Rayleigh let women in, and he was quite, supportive of women.
I think in the 19th century there was quite a scientific dynasty, because if you were a young man and you wanted to be a scientist, you chose your wife from another scientific family because you knew that she would have been well educated in science by her father and her brothers. And so there are a lot of people like, for example, Charles Lyell, the geologist, who deliberately chose the daughter of a scientist, and Mary Lyell was very, very important in his research. She learnt German, she translated everything into English, and she was in charge of the shell collection, which might not sound very significant, but if you're a geologist and you're looking at marine evidence of vanished eras, being in charge of the shells is extremely, extremely important, and she edited a lot of his papers. There's loads of examples like that before men started going out to scientific laboratories, when research was taking place at home. There were a lot of concealed women, or there were a lot of women who were very, very active, but all the work is attributed to their men, or else all the men take all the credit, would be a more accurate way of putting it.
Right. But they were family enterprises, weren't they, really?
Yeah. There's one person you've mentioned, Rena Scott, I find very interesting, because
she's a similar example.
Because she's one who was sort of hidden.
Yeah, her father was a geologist. She became a paleobotanist, and that's another area. There was a lot of women in paleobotany. Mary Stopes started off as a paleobotany. I think she was one of the first women to get a PhD, but in Germany she got her degree,
she
PhD.
was the first university lecturer, I think, in
Manchester. Yeah, that's right. But Rena, she married D.H. Scott, Dukenfield Henry Scott, always known as D.H. Scott, who was a Fellow of the Royal Society and also the director of the Jodrell Laboratory at Kew. And of course, Rena was taught in sort of doing drawings for his books and things, as well as doing her own research in paleobotany.
That's what I find so interesting, is that she did research, of course, but those photographs you showed were absolutely stunning. And
she did that completely. That was her own independent work. She was one of the first females of the Linnaean Society, and she also published papers in their journal and showed her animated photographs. But this was so early, and it was something she did completely by herself. But she also, she also did illustrations and assisted, in quote marks, her husband's books. And I love looking at the dedications, because they say, "to my wife for her assistance," all the way through. And it's kind of not quite true. And that's another example might be Grace Chisholm Young, a mathematician, who basically was a woman who got her PhD, another very early PhD. She got it at Girton in the Shrine of Pure Mathematics. And she basically taught her husband, who was a lowly coach, mathematics coach at Cambridge, taught him maths. And then they made a pact that he'd go out and get a job and write the book. And they'd write the books together, but they'd only be published under his name. It was part of the way, it was part of the way that wifehood was kind of interpreted at that time.
Was that because they thought that the book would be taken more seriously if it was by him?
Yes, and also I think he was fairly jealous of his position as well, and being overshadowed by his wife. Reading his letters, there's one where there's some reminiscence that he says, "Oh, are you going to be one of those people who ask me about my wife before me," or something. So he was quite kind of a little bit bristled that his wife was this amazing woman who got her PhD in pure mathematics.
But she didn't mind.
No, she did actually, yes, but it didn't.
She did mind.
She did. I mean, there's quite a few papers co-written, but under his name in the Royal Society transactions, and she was also published under her own name. Often it was under joint names, but they called themselves the company of Grace Chisholm Young and William Henry Young.
I do find this very interesting, something you picked up on the end there, that it actually during the 19th century almost became actually harder for women to be taken seriously, because qualifications and publishing did become more important. And I find that very interesting, that things became harder for women. So how did that sort of leach out in another way? Did they find other ways to get around this? And was that by creating popular science instead of academic science? And is that what kind of led a lot of women into that area? Because there does seem to be this thing that people like Rena Scott creating those incredible photographs, it wasn't just to get across some of the science, but there was a desire to make something really stunning, really profound, but also very beautiful, something that anyone could look at. And rather than a page of text describing what they're like, you can see instantly, anyone can see what the development of a plant is like. And is that something that you think is a particular feminine quality, or is this something that has come about because of the circumstances that women have found a way to do their science? It'd be interesting to get an opinion from all of you about that. Is women writing science a thing that women do, or is this because of the circumstances that have surrounded them, that's how their science comes out?
There does seem to be an element of that it's sort of, it seems like a sort of easy bypass to kind of just go straight to the sort of mass audience that maybe publish, I don't know, but I mean that would, assuming that publishers are quite open to that, I guess, because you're still having to go through them.
I think women have often done work like translation or popularisation because it's something that you can do in relatively short bursts and fit in with all your other household responsibilities, which Mary Somerville, for example, very definitely had in the 19th century. In terms of the photography, photography was one of these new technologies like typing and computing, that at the beginning there were a lot of women who were doing photography, and I don't think it's particularly a women's idea to visualise. I mean, if you think of Edward Muybridge doing all those fabulous photographs round about the same time. And I think there's also, and I think you have to distinguish very clearly between what women are constrained into doing. So, for example, translation and popularization was something that they were able to do in the circumstances they were brought up, and saying that women like to visualize, because that's a reverting, I think, to rather an essentialist view of what women can do, and this sort of old-fashioned idea that women can draw pretty pictures, but when it gets down to writing the text and having rational abilities, women aren't so gifted. So I personally wouldn't like to think that women focus on visualization.
Certainly with Rena, I mean, the chromatograph was quite big and heavy to lug about, and also you needed sort of smelly chemicals, so it wasn't a kind of sort of feminine drawing type of thing. But to go back to your question, I think also popularising science, writing for children and lay audiences, kind of was an extension of the female motherly role to educate. You educate your children, you educate the wider world as well. And I think in that way, it kind of complemented ideas of femininity and feminine roles. I think that's another reason why, it, you know, as well as it's something that women could do at home.
And also,
as well.
I mean, there were several women who did it. Priscilla Wakefield, for example, was a populariser in the early 19th century. And the reason she was forced into it was her husband was a complete waster, and he gambled all the money away, and there wasn't any left. And she had I don't know how many children. So she went out there and she did something she could do at home. She wrote all these popular science books, and she kept the whole family on the road.
Yeah. And so, as a means of a career, she created a career out of necessity.
Yes, so I mean, I think it's very easy to knock women and say, oh, they were only translators and popularisers. But you can also say, well, they were very ingenious. They carved out a place for themselves, in spite of not having any education, in spite of not going to university, in spite of having to bring up all the children and everything. They managed to fulfil an extremely important function. That's why I deliberately gave that example of Michael Faraday. I mean, we wouldn't be sitting here with, arguably, we wouldn't be sitting here with PowerPoint if Madame Massey hadn't written Conversations on Chemistry. That sounds a bit like an exam question. Discuss.
Because I think there is this element as well that I think that you've all picked up on, that whether it is nature or circumstance, that especially what you mentioned, the different masculine education and the feminine education, the so-called feminine education seems to be something that is very useful in science today, because science now is so multidisciplinary. It is so across all subjects. It is so about sharing your work and communicating with each other. The good old days where you could sit with a pipette and some thing on fire and discover a new element, those times have gone. Is science being a more collaborative process now? Is that something that is clearly something that do women bring something to modern science, or is this again a question of is it terrible to say that because you're feminising or masculinising science? You're disagreeing with me viciously.
I'm saying again,
absolutely.
it's sort of going back to essentialism, and I know for a lot of, I mean, all science now is collaborative teamwork, but I know that within teams there's some pretty savage competition going on. It's not, and by men as well as by women. I mean, it's a huge difference, and there always has been, between the ideology of science and science as it is actually practiced. And now the ideology is you have these large teams and they all cooperate, but there's huge rivalry within the team, and as well as between the teams.
Because I remember as growing up and studying physics, so my image of a physicist was someone who did everything on their own with a pot and a pipette in a basement somewhere. And then I discovered that it was hugely collaborative, but then again, you still had to imprint your own personality on what you're doing.
But don't you think Marie Curie's got a lot to answer, or at least the people who perpetuated the image of her, because she's always promoted as this woman who's very, very clever but was completely abnormal, and she's always shown on her own, and she sacrificed everything. She sacrificed her health, she wasn't interested in clothes, and all she did, according to the children's stories anyway, was she spent weeks and weeks and months sieving pitch blend to get the little bit of radium. And it always seemed to me when I was a child, well, that was a bit like cooking in the kitchen, only instead of putting things through the kitchen sieve, you're doing it on a massive industrial scale. So stories like that reinforce the idea that a woman who, to be a Marie Curie, you really have to be a complete freak and not a very sociable person.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's a lot of examples you've brought up, and I think there are many people here tonight who I think buck those trends very much. So I think what I'd like to do is open up to the audience to see if there are any questions about things that we've mentioned in the talks and also things that we've mentioned in that discussion. So do we have any questions from... Oh, there was a hand straight up there and there's a microphone just there. If you could speak very clearly into the microphone.
Is this clear enough? Okay. We now and in the past sort of 10 or 20 years, there's been great emphasis placed on women's networks. And I was wondering, is there any evidence in the historical record of these women talking to each other? I guess there might have been only one or two in each field, but was there any awareness that they were a breed of, they were female scientists? And if so, what did they say to each other?
Brilliant.
Marie Curie and Hertha Ayrton?
Absolutely, yes.
Wowza.
Yeah. There's quite a few women. I mean, the Balfour Laboratory, created... The Balfour Laboratory at Cambridge was a women-only laboratory that was set up for women, and there's kind of a female culture grew up around there. There's lots of examples of women publishing papers together. Certainly Irena Scott published with Edith Saunders. Yes, they did support each other very much so. And mathematicians, there was quite a lot of support amongst mathematicians, Girton graduates and others, but coming together to support each other. And the University Women's Club was set up precisely for this. I'm trying to think of the date, but I can't.
So women coming together in order to campaign to be admitted into society. So they're admitted into the Chemical Society, for example, long before the Royal Society, because there was a big group of women chemists who
and
got
in fact,
together.
Marjorie Farquharson, I love that name, I can never say Farquharson, got together a lot of women who got together to try and fight for the Royal Society first, and they put a petition in before Hertha, and other societies. So Patricia's absolutely right, they kind of got each society in their sight and got together to try and...
Really? Coordinated effort?
Absolutely, yes.
Fantastic. Yeah. And also you mentioned the Herschels, the kind of your area of knowledge. It seems like there's generations and generations of female Herschels.
Yeah, they're very good at supporting each other within the generations. I mean, Caroline Herschel kind of kept herself... She didn't really kind of mix with other women. I mean, she didn't really mix with anyone outside her family, so she kind of stayed in. Whereas, sort of 2 generations on, Constance Herschel is very much part of this kind of Girton. I think maybe just having women colleges sort of created that whole women sticking together.
And the example I gave of Hertha Ayrton and Marie Curie, they were both married to scientists, and they met each other. I think it was the Royal Society at a conference they first met, and they became very close friends because, I mean, the normal thing was that while the male scientists were having their conferences, all the women were going off shopping and playing golf or whatever women did in those days. So Hertha Ayrton and Marie Curie were a bit stuck because they were women scientists themselves. And then later on, when Marie Curie was going through a very, very difficult time in her life because she was being vilified by the press, she came over to England and Hertha Ayrton gave her a cottage and looked after her. So I think that's an excellent example of women supporting each other at a difficult time.
Yeah, fantastic. Another question? Do we have any hands? We have hands. Oh, wow.
I was wondering where you thought Mary Anning sort of sat in the scheme of things. I mean, she seemed to have had a double whammy. Not only was she a woman, but she was also working class. Yeah. And I don't know of any other examples where somebody from that background was able to make very much headway at all. I just wondered what your thoughts were on Mary Anning.
So Mary Anning, who's the famous fossil hunter.
She was a fossil hunter who at Lyme Regis. Who, I mean, she was an excellent manipulator because all the geologists who lived in London had to come down to Dorset and they had to buy their fossils from her, and they're entirely dependent on her for their fossil discoveries. So I think she was an example of a great entrepreneur, and she did become extremely knowledgeable. I mean, she never went to university, but she was it's easy to sort of patronise her as the working class collector who just happened to find some bones and sell them off. She became very technically knowledgeable about the skeletons she was discovering, and she needed to be in order to tell which discovery was important and what was new, and how much money she could charge. I mean, if it's the same old dinosaur she's been flogging for the last 6 weeks, she's not going to be able to make much money out of it. But if it's a new kind of dinosaur or fossil, she can sell it for a vast amount.
Brilliant. So that's more taking that idea of Mary Anning, and she was an entrepreneur, and she was.
Well, that's my interpretation. I mean, other people might think completely differently.
She was playing the scientists off against each other and
yes,
using that for her own ends. Much credit, due respect. And any other questions from the floor? There's another question there. If we just hold on for the microphone to get to you so we can hear the whole of your question.
I was wondering, do you think the reason why science communication is quite female-dominated nowadays, do you think it's still because it's easier for women to stay connected to science and go on have a family rather than staying an active researcher?
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting question, because I think you all have a historic perspective on this, but do you have a personal perspective as yourselves as women in modern society as well? So for a personal... So the question was, there's a lot of women in science communication specifically, more so than science, more so than as opposed to science. Is that because it's easier to stay connected with science and continue to have a family and take breaks?
It's certainly not true in my case.
Your question.
I mean, I got a degree in physics, and I knew by the second year that I never ever wanted to be in a physics laboratory ever again. And it wasn't because I found it too difficult. I mean, I did quite well in my exams. I just found it really boring and tedious, those endless experiments that went on for hours and hours and hours. And I think being a historian and being involved in communication is just vastly more interesting than being stuck in a lab. But that's only my personal feeling, and Ophelia is probably about to slaughter me.
Telling it to you straight there, Patricia. But do you have a personal perspective as well?
It's interesting to try and see a parallel between women as science communicators in the 19th century, say, and women now. And that's a really interesting thing. Just sort of off the top of my head, I would have thought, yes, there are parallels. It probably is easier to do that, the way that science is often structured in universities now. I mean, I am a historian, I'm not a scientist, but I can see it's much easier for women perhaps to have a profession in science communication, writing articles, sort of being more flexible than it is actually to be in a lab somewhere. It would be interesting to investigate, so that's a lovely question, because I'm quite thinking that's a nice research project to sort of investigate the parallels.
I think there are
I can see a paper coming out.
There are currently a lot of female scientists doing that piece of research currently in their careers as well.
Yes.
And yeah.
See, I don't know, because I think, I mean, in museums you find the same thing, that you get that the outreach tends to be what women end up being a part of. I don't know if it's just a hangover, part of it at least is like a hangover from this idea that women are supposed to be good at good communicators, and I wonder if it's partly tied up in that, because it doesn't seem to be specifically to do with science. Mm-hmm. You seem to find it in other things too.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's interesting. There is one. How are we doing for time? There's one hand that's been up for a very long time at the back there, and I've only just seen you. If we can hold on for the microphone, this is going to be the last question before the last part of this event.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hello. I'll keep it quick then. You guys must have read so much, and basically, I just like the juiciest thing that you read, the most sort of egregious examples of someone basically sort of dismissing females, something that made your jaw drop when you read it and you went, he said what?
So the most offensive thing, or if you'd like to reverse that, I would say the most positive thing, give you an opportunity. No? Okay. All right, one of each. I'm just giving a get out here. # not all men.
I've got one. About Hertha Ayrton, we've talked about a lot, but when her husband died in 1908, William Ayrton, who was a Fellow of the Royal Society and electrical engineer, one of his colleagues wrote the obituary at the Central Institution and wrote about Hertha that if he'd had a wife who'd been there when he got home, had put out his slippers for him, given him his pipe, instead of trying to worry her head about science and talking to him about it, then he would have lived a longer and much more productive life. So he blamed Hertha for totally ruining Edward Ayrton's life.
Can either of you top that, or should we leave it there? Wow, that is genuinely extraordinary. Thank you so much to our speakers. Thank you so much for those brilliant questions as well. We have one final thing to do this evening, which I think we've all been waiting for. You've had this shroud just behind you, and we now come to the opportunity to let you know what's underneath it. And actually, to do that, we're going to welcome to the stage someone who is going to trigger off the revealing of this sculpture. Now, we have Dame Athena Donald, who is a fellow and professor of experimental physics at the University of Cambridge. You've already seen her on the big screen, but she is actually here live in the room right now. She was elected a fellow here at the Royal Society in 1999, and she served on several committees here. As well as that, she's been elected as the next president of the British Science Association. She is, I know, an extraordinary woman, and I don't know how she does, but she does also find time to be a tireless and authoritative voice on the advancement of women in science. So there is no more appropriate person to join us on stage to say a few words about the recipient of this sculpture. So thank you, Athena Donald.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, I am indeed here in person. It's quite intimidating sitting, watching yourself on the big screen. So now we get to a very exciting event. We saw in the film the bust of Mary Somerville. I suspect what is lurking under there, and I haven't seen it, I suspect that is probably only going to be the second bust of a woman here. I don't know of any other. There's Dorothy Hodgkin's hands, there's a cast of her hands, and there are some pictures of women if you look around, but only a handful. But I think this must be going to be the second bust. Anyone want to tell me I'm wrong on that? I'm wrong. Right, Keith. You can tell me later. Okay, well, it's 2 and a bit. Anyhow, what we're going to see next is the unveiling of one of the Society's talented University Research Fellows, Dr. Lucy Green. Let me give you a bit of background. After loaning us several pieces of a sculpture for the recent Scientists exhibition, award-winning sculptor Marcus Cornish, who is also here, offered to gift the Society with a bust of a young female scientist. And in collaboration with the library, represented by Keith at the back, the officers of the Society drafted a short list of some outstanding early career women scientists for Marcus to consider, and in the end he chose Lucy. Now, Lucy is a space scientist based at the Mullard Space Science Laboratory. She studies the atmosphere of the sun, particularly coronal mass ejection and the ways in which they can drive major space weather events, and I hope I've got that right. She's a Royal Society University Research Fellow, as I mentioned, and she sits on the board of the European Solar Physics Division of the European Physical Society, and I know Lucy through this, she sits on the advisory board of the Science Museum, which I do too. She's passionate about science education. She's a brilliant communicator, so maybe she's got some views about parallels between science communication in the past and now. And she does a lot of work in public engagement. And she's also served on the Royal Society's Education Committee, and again, I overlapped with her there. And she was awarded the 2009 Cone Award for Excellence in Public Engagement. Now, you've seen one of the Royal Society's 350th anniversary of publishing films tonight. Lucy stars in another one, and hers is called Beyond, if I've got it right. And in this, she talks to Len Culhane about the early days of science in space. So if you want to know more about her and her interests, perhaps you should watch that film. When asked why he chose Lucy, Marcus said he was inspired by the story of Clytie, I hope that's the correct pronunciation, from Ovid's Metamorphoses. And as the myth goes, Clytie, who loved Apollo, the god of the sun, was turned to a sunflower, which was forever changing following the sun's passage in the sky. And the sculpture, I understand, is based on this story and Lucy's passion for studying the sun. And in her hands are gold sunflower seeds, which represent the legacy of her involvement in science
communication and passing on what she's learnt, inspiring and educating others. And I think that's a lovely sort of story. So now, Lucy and Marcus, over to you.
Okay, we have no prepared words, I'm afraid, so we'll just go for it. Here it is.
That's wonderful stuff. Thank you so much, Athena Donald, Mark and Lucy as well. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Of course, this whole event will be online in a short period of time. If you want to pass this on to anyone else to watch this again, please do. And also, if you're interested in any more of the Royal Society events, you have your brochures on the table, on your chairs, and you have the event listings online. If you would like to fill in the feedback forms before you leave, we will very gratefully take them off your hands. But I think what we would love to do now is just give a huge round of applause to our speakers here tonight. Claire Fara. No, I'm going to get this completely wrong, aren't I? I'm going to have to pick up Patricia. If I do a sort of mix and match, then you all get 3 times as much applause. Patricia Fara, Claire Jones, Emily Winterburn, of course, Athena Donald, Lucy and Mark as well. I'm sure many of you will want to come and get a slightly closer look at this incredible sculpture, whether it's here tonight or in the Royal Society where it will be displayed. Can we have a huge round of applause for all the people who have contributed tonight? Thank you so much.